Hello, class. Welcome back. This is session 2 of theory. And we left off presenting Malinowski and his contribution to the field of anthropology. We presented what was going on in his time, how he revolutionized this field by introducing methods such as fieldwork, long-term fieldwork, and participant observation. And also, in his work, he refuted ideas of evolution, such as Taylor's notion of categorizing humans in a hierarchical way based on their belief systems. And Malinowski's work refutes this. And one of his contributions is the idea of magic, science, and religion are equally rational. In his work with observing and participating in rituals and working with the community and with the specialist, the spiritual guides or the religious specialist, he observed how these rituals have logic and have a rationale as they are being conducted to bring about a result. So these activities are not of primitive mind, as Taylor would say, but in fact, they are systems of knowledge, systems created to control the forces of nature to bring about a result. So whether it's, religious specialists asking for prayers or conducting rituals, asking for rain for the harvest, science would be creating irrigation or using machinery to also bring about the harvest. Both are equally rational and are seeking a result, working to control the forces of nature, whether it's in petition or using technology to bring about a result. So he completely refutes Taylor's idea to put modern society, in this case Europe at the time, to put them on as the most as the society in the highest point of evolution. Okay, so now let's go to Malinowski. Let me capture this. I'm sorry, Franz Boas. Franz Boas is the founder of anthropology here in the U.S., also a very well-educated scholar. He already had his PhD in physics and geography, and he emerged in this new field of anthropology. He also conducted field work, spending many months, years at a time, working with different cultures. He worked with the Inuits, and he also worked with Native Americans from Canada to here the U.S. He collected a lot of artifacts, stories, textiles, and so forth, and in an attempt to help revive these cultures that were at risk of being lost. Again, many Native American cultures did not have the practice of leaving written records, but rather practice transmitting their information in oral tradition. Many cultures across the world still do this. And therefore, Boas' work among the Native Americans collected a lot of art and mask and stories and tried to transmit their language. And he also revolutionized the way things are presented and stored in museums. But however, one of his greatest contribution to the field of anthropology, based on his experience and going against these evolutionary ideas that were very prevalent at the time, that brought these social implications that we are still facing today, the idea of race and racism. The idea of racism is believing that the way someone looks, that they are genetically, that they have genetic inherited traits that make some human population superior to others. And at his time, during his time, he refuted these theories, working with Native American cultures. He presents the notion that if the cultures are relative. In other words, there is no absolute truth. Each culture must be studied from their point of view. And if you really, really want to understand and be able to understand this, first you have to have self-reflection. First you have to look at how your culture influences the way you view the world, and avoid this idea of ethnocentrism, that your culture, the way you do things is the original way, it's the natural way, it's the right way or superior way. Because if you approach studying another cultural practice coming already with these evolutionary ideas of modernism, and therefore at the superior to others, looking at other cultures as primitive, then you will not be able to comprehend and really understand aspects of that culture. So he provides this cultural relativism, that every culture must be studied from their vantage point, from their point of view. All right? And Boaz has many students that become very famous. One of his students is Margaret Mead. Now, Margaret Mead, pay attention to the time frame that she's living in. She's from the 1920s to in the 1920s, 1950s is when she does a lot of her work, her most famous work. So she's a student of Boaz, and at the time, she is debating a scientific hypothesis that was in the 20s of Stanley Hall's stress hypothesis. This was a debate of nature versus nurture. Stanley Hall's scientific hypothesis is saying that emotional stress and turmoil is biologically inherited among American adolescents. In other words, you can't avoid it. It's inevitable. All teenagers will go through stress and turmoil. It's just in the genes. And in this time, Boaz debates this debate, as we've mentioned it in linguistics. It's a debate that's still, many times you'll hear it ongoing. Is it nature? Is it our biology? Is it does our biology, overrule everything else, our environment and so forth? Or is it nurture, the way we are, our environment, the way we are raised, that determines how we behave? Now, during her time, Mead is living in a time of segregation. And being a student of Boaz is also constantly fighting these ideas of evolutionary theories, of racism, of separation, of viewing different people, categorizing people in that way. So she sets out to do her field work in the islands of Samoa. And at this time, she's 23 years old, and she arrives there to the islands and quickly is able to socialize and be accepted by the teenage girls. And so in her interviews and socialization, she observes how during this teenage phase, they're not suffering these rebellious turmoil outbursts such as adolescents in the United States. And she observes the way, particularly, these teenage girls behave, And she presents that they have this freedom to move around the island, to socialize at night, and to even meet boys at night, and in many cases were promiscuous. But it wasn't seen as something negative, and it wasn't anything that was affecting their ability for marital status. Now, she makes note that the daughters of the high-ranking officials were very valued and were to remain virgins. But the rest of the population, she did not find this social stress and cultural importance on virginity in this case. So she comes back to the U.S. and she publishes her book, Coming of Age in Samoa. And her theory basically comes to the point of saying your culture determines how you behave. So it's called cultural determinism or determination. And so she's saying it is nurture. It is how we nurture, enculturate, a child rearing. This is what determines the way you behave 100%. It's not how the transformation that takes place in your body. It's not genetics. It's not it's not a given, and therefore her study caught on like wildfire in the U.S. You have to understand everything that was going on at the time, not only from racism but women's rights. It inspired the counterculture movements of the 60s. Mead was invited to speak in various universities and would draw crowds of young people inspired by her work in Samoa. And this inspired also women's liberation and so forth. So in her work, she becomes very, very famous in the U.S., becomes a renowned not only academic in academia, but is also consulted for other fields in politics and so forth. And we're going to come back to Mead because she became so famous and her work really brought back, and people were reading her book and questioning the way our culture was here in the U.S., how we were raising our children. And so we're coming out of this era from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s era. And once you take your history class, you'll see how the role of family was structured, women's roles, etc., women's rights, and the way women's bodies were also seen. So Margaret Mead in her work had great influence, not the only one, and not the only one, but it was one of the works that had great influence in the counterculture that was being, gaining momentum. All right, so we're going to come back to Mead on the third part because a great debate comes about from this. Okay. So other fields of study that inspired anthropology and how we view things, what we should pay attention to. This is psychology. So psychology and anthropology. So in the early 20th century, the field of psychology was also gaining momentum and had much contribution to our understanding how the mind works. And in particular, this psychologist, Sigmund Freud, he presents in his research, in his trying to understand what was taking place and how he could help his patients that would suffer neurosis. They were neurotic, stress. There was patients. There's a famous case of a patient, Anna, that would suffer even paralysis when she would undergo such stress. So at this time, the field of psychology was trying to find methods to help people deal with these mental stressors, and they were trying to understand how it worked. And Sigmund Freud did a lot of research. He was also a very well-educated scholar. By the age of 6, he already spoke, by the age of 12, he already spoke about 6 languages. So he was very ambitious and very determined, very studious, and he emerged in this new field of psychology in trying to understand what causes these mental stressors. These expressions of neurosis and so forth, and his contribution and his work makes him the father of modern psychology and psychoanalysis, because he discovered the subconscious mind. If you've heard the expression, the tip of the iceberg, this is only the tip of the iceberg, is because when you're looking at an iceberg, on the bottom, it's much larger. So if you see, it's as twice as big as, in the bottom. And so what we're looking at, what we are expressing, and these modes of neurotic expression that patients were revealing, that is what we could see. That would be the conscious mind. But what was really, really causing this is he realized that deep within the mind, we have a subconscious mind and unconscious mind is what we conceal. And therefore, therefore, the way humans learn, he discovered that in the subconscious mind, it holds memories, it holds experiences, it holds traumas, or perhaps even fantasies from a very young age, from a childhood age. Now, at the time, to think of as children that we were already recording and being conscious was very new. So he presents these ideas of, everything that we experience as a child in our environment from birth, we are recording it. We are recording it deep in our minds. And the way we are being educated, passed on our cultural, social ideas, and being exposed to these ideas in our environment repetitively, this creates a social conditioning. So Freud suggests that cultures were systems of thought in which people received through indoctrination. And so he brings to light a strong focus on child rearing and how the mind is shaped. And he introduces, in the case to the field of anthropology, to look at cultures as systems of thought, as systems of repetitive learning, social conditioning, and not as something, that is just genetically inherited. So he's looking at experiences, and he, he has a very interesting life and history of how he came about this discovery. Okay, All right. So Freud, Freud is going to have great contribution to the field of anthropology as he presents, again, cultures as systems of thought, and let's pay attention to how to their social conditioning. In other words, how we're learning about our culture and the social ideas in this repetitive being introduced to these experiences, and having these repetitive experiences creates this social conditioning and so forth. So he dives into discovering the subconscious mind, and this is rooted in like I said, in either experiences and traumas, or even fantasies, ideas, desires that that were experienced as a child, and they are stored in the subconscious, and therefore later on are expressed in what we can see. Now, Carl Jung expands on the subconscious and makes further contribution to the subconscious, in saying that the way these memories are stored, they are stored in the forms of symbols, in the forms of archetypes. And one way that we can tap into these ideas of a culture is by looking at their mythology. Now, this is Carl Jung's contribution that anthropology integrated. And so while he presents the idea of archetypes and symbols, of how the mind in the subconscious, how we store these symbols, if we want to learn about a culture, we look at their symbols and look at their mythology. Now, when he talks about mythology, it's not referring to something as false. It's referring to these symbolic stories that reveal a history or a belief system of a culture. So when looking at a culture, you want to know about, we find symbols in these, for example, in the creation stories or in the history of a culture, we find certain symbols that reflect nature, fire, water, wind, the flora, the fauna, the earth, the moon, the sun, etc. And then, so each culture has their own type of each culture has their own type of symbols and meanings, and by paying attention to this in their creation stories and their legends, we can understand how these symbols are transmitted. So mythology is basically the recollection of the symbols and meanings that each culture produces, and the stories are created to symbolize the history of the culture or the belief system. So these are symbolic stories. So this is before, now we have the field of history, but as I mentioned, such in the case of Native Americans, many cultures around the world pass on their knowledge through oral tradition, and it is in these oral tradition that we find these symbolic stories that talk about their history, their legends, their heroes, their land, etc. All right. So from here on out, anthropology begins to pay attention to the subconscious mind and to these symbols as reservoirs of information, of memories, and a way that we can tap into the history and belief system of a culture. So from here we have another theorist. He's an anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he presents, taking inspired by Freud and Jung, he presents this idea that yes, these symbols are stored in the mind, but the way these symbols are stored, they're stored in a hierarchical structure, and they begin by the way we learn about our culture. Yes, we learn them through these symbols, and these symbols are the building blocks of the culture mind. And the way we acquire these symbols, we don't acquire them randomly, but rather we store them in our minds in this form of organization. We start first with the nature symbols, symbols representing nature, our environment. We have, for example, the sun, the moon, and so forth. Then we go on into another layer, which we're learning about the world of humans. We're learning on the social realm of human. And here we have stories of the heroes, of the villains, of the kings, the queens, and so forth. Then we go into the other structure of the more cosmological, spiritual realm, ideas of creation and so forth. So here we have the stories of the god or the gods, and how everything came about. And one of his greatest, so in this idea that the way we store symbols in our mind is structurally organized, and beginning from these categories, from our introduction to our environment, to our awareness and stories of the human world, and then to stories of more abstract ideas of the creators or creation. And this is called the idea of structuralism. And so these are ideas of how the cultural mind is built and is structured. And one of his greatest contributions that we still pay attention to and use is that he says, while the cultural mind consists of this structure, it has all these symbols have binary oppositions. Means the way humans view the world, we view things in duality. Everything has an opposite. So all of these symbols, whether they're from our environment, the earthly symbols, to the human world, to the cosmological spiritual world, everything has an opposite. So we have good, we have evil, we have day, we have the night. We could have the hero, the villain, etc. So in some cosmologies, the god, the devil, the heavens, or the celestial world, and the underworld, heaven, hell, and things like that. So he says, pay attention to these symbols, these mythical symbols, and this is a way to be able to decode the cultural mind. And because every culture, he says, every culture has this duality. And any symbol that you get in any culture, you will always find that it has this positive and negative characteristic to it. And I'll just present one example using the Mayas. The ancient Mayas had a goddess known as Ixchel. Ixchel is the goddess of the moon, the goddess of fertility, the giver of life, of medicine. She has an island that was devoted to her, with a structure that has been, there's not much of a structure left there. But this island, for the Mayas, at one point they would do great pilgrimages from all over the Maya world to make offerings to the goddess Ishel. Women would petition to have healthy births, to be married, to be cured, she represented the giver of life. But just as that, in the codices, she also represents how she brought about the great floods, also brought about death and destruction of the world. And so here we find this duality, as she's a giver of life and also is able to bring about the destruction, the end of it. Okay. So this is Levi-Strauss. And in the case of this, he would say, all right, if you're learning about Ishel, what is her binary opposition? What are the characteristics that we find that are opposite to each other, as we discussed here? So another anthropologist, and this is Marcel Grill. He is the father of the French School of Anthropology, and also inspired by these ideas of mythic symbols, and as holding historical memories and information about a culture. He goes on to elaborate a little bit about, if you want to know and understand the symbols, learn about the cosmology, learn about the worldview, and how man, the culture that you're studying, how humans view themselves in relationship to the cosmos. Because if you're able to understand this, there are many things around them. For example, the way they structure their buildings, the way they structure their whole city is a reflection of this. And he worked with the Dongons of West Africa, and he paid attention to how they structured their houses, how they structured their society, as kind of a recreation of their creation myths. And he also advised, in order to be able to tap into the cosmology and the worldview, work with the religious specialist of the community. Is it the shaman? Is it the priest? Is it the healer? Etc. So they hold the information, the guide, to be able to understand this cosmology and worldview. So we find this, and when we get into looking into architecture, we will elaborate more on Marcel Grill and how this applies. But just one example that I'll give you today. Working with a Mayan priest, influenced by Grill, I knew when I started working among the Mayans that I would want to specialize working with the Achamen, the surviving Mayan priest, and paying attention to the way they initiate any ceremony, whether it's a community ceremony and petition for rain, or is it a Thanksgiving ceremony for the harvest, for individual plots of land, to petition for a good harvest, so forth. All the ceremonies, the Achamen places himself in the center, and therefore recreating the cosmological vision of how they view things. And he always starts with a petition by looking at the east, receiving the sun, and then the west, where the sun sets, the north, where the cold wind comes, and ending south. And the local Mayans that still have traditional housing, these circular houses that I showed at the beginning, of the semester, the way they structure their houses, the front door faces east, and it's a circular structure, and with two doors, and the front door must face the east, and the back door faces the west. And when I asked about why they structure it this way, he said, well, we receive the sun, so the front door must be facing the sun, because if it faces the north, then we risk receiving illness, as the north brings the cold winds, and so forth. So we'll elaborate more on Mayan architecture and how they structured their buildings and even their cities based on the cosmology. So Grill, great contribution to the field, and in his work with Conversations with Ototomeli, he provides his interviews and his knowledge about the Dogon of West Africa, and the logic behind their rituals and their construction of their households and environment and so forth, as a recreation of their cosmology, of their myths. Okay. And lastly, we'll end with Victor Turner. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's many theorists and anthropologists that have made great contributions. The theories that I have presented today, we will be touching back on them and using them when we look at cultural examples. Okay, and Victor Turner elaborated and expanded his observation of rituals, and he elaborated on paying attention not only to the cultural symbols. In every ritual, we find important symbols of the culture. That's where, very similar to what Grill say. Marcel Grill is, we find ideas and representation of their cosmology. But Victor Turner documented and observed a lot of rituals, and in particular, rites of passages. Rites of passages are initiation rites, when the person is transitioning in a different role, a different social role. And he expanded on this theory and noted the 3 stages that a person goes through when undergoing a rites of passage. And let's think about the rites of passage in our society and everyday knowledge, such as marriage. And we'll apply these 3 steps. So the first step, I'm going to explain the first of 3 steps, and then we'll apply some examples to it, okay? So the first step is when the person is going to undergo a change in social status, a life change, they go through a period of separation. That person is no longer, is separating from their current status. And then they undergo a stage of liminality. Liminality is a very important stage. It's in the in-between. You have stopped having this recognition, this role. You're in transition. This is a phase of transition. And in many rituals, let's say when it's a coming of age ritual, when a person is becoming a woman or a man in their society, in this stage is when they gain a lot of the information, the knowledge, how things should be. In other cases, in secret societies that we will cover, this is where they get these codes to, to undergo this ritual and have this knowledge, be able to access this knowledge. So this is a stage of liminality. It's transition. You're in limbo here. And finally, when the rite is completed, when the ceremony is completed and the person undergoes the initiation, then they are reincorporated into society. And when they come back, they're looked at with a different status. There's many examples in your everyday life and in ritual practices that we see this. Marriage, as I mentioned, the first step, the person is engaged. That person is no longer single. That person is no longer available, or has been, called upon to be married. And so that it begins the separation of this social role, of this social status or marker. This stage of liminality includes a whole preparation of the wedding, and depending on, the ceremony or the ritual that is to take place, this liminality is where everything is learned, what tradition, what ceremony is going to be carried out, what expression, the whole thing in between. But you're not married yet, so you're in between. It's in limbo. Also, usually in this stage, the person undergoes a challenge to be able to overcome and go to the next stage. So in liminality in marriage, we know, depending on, like I said, the preparation or the type of celebration, there's other students have asked me, well, what does the bachelorette party and all of these things have to play? Well, the way I kind of view it is in this challenge. It's the last, it's a symbolic celebration of you will no longer be single, and in many cases they're put through these temptations, right? Symbolic temptations. And lastly, in this liminality, the whole ceremony is taking place. And finally, they conclude the ceremony, and the couple is now officially married. And therefore, when they walk out of the ceremony, and I'm just using a visual here, when the ceremony is concluded and they are reincorporated into society, and they are reincorporated with a new title, a new role, a new responsibility. Okay? And in many rites of passages, so we'll look at several examples in this course, and how also our modern society, how sometimes we've lost these initiation rites, such as the coming of age ceremonies. And we'll look at these three stages. So for Victor Turner, his contribution is expanding on the theory of rites of passage, initiation rites, and providing these three stages that the person goes through during this transition. Okay? All right, so we are going to stop here. Our second class, our last class on theory, will deal with a great controversy that took place with the famous Margaret Mead, and I'll provide a film for you to get a very good visual of everything that was going on at the time, and these ideas that, while Margaret Mead of her time was debating these ideas of its nature, there's nothing you can do about it. That's just the way things are. And she brings about these ideas that it is culture, it is our nurture that influences how we behave, and this will become a great field, a great topic of debate. All right, so we'll end there, And if you have any questions, just email me. We're getting ready for our test, so just contact me with any questions. Thank you.